Hey, everybody. Welcome to Hardpoints, podcast about energy, security, startup economy, how they intersect to shape the world around you. We unpack the real dynamics behind the headlines, what's changing, what it means, why it matters to you. Thanks for being here. Neal, what's going on in your world, dude?
I'm getting ready to leave for a bit. Everybody's on vacation, so I figured I might as well go too.
Good riddance.
It's time. It's like almost July 4th, and heck, let's go make it happen.
Yeah, what's more American than leaving the country?
Yeah, we didn't plan it that way. I just honestly, as a startup founder type person, I'm not the founder. I keep clarifying that I'm a startup CEO, but I always wanted, and I always believed that July 4th week should just be off. So now I get to decide, and for my company, July 4th is off.
I love that, dude. Everything about it. I've, increasingly mixed feelings about my patriotism, though I remain patriotic. And so, but the 4th of July, historically, was always my favorite holiday. It's awesome. It's like everything historically that's been like great about America, like relax with family and friends. It's sense of community, not too much circumstance, a little bit of patriotism, mixed into it, and a hot dog and a beer.
Yeah.
My 4th of July weekend's going to be great, man. I've got a barbecue, a concert at Red Rocks, and a baseball game. So it's just like America all the way.
That's awesome, man. Well, also it should be longer than a weekend. That's my
100%,
point. And also we get these like long breaks over the winter months, but there's no, the kids are out of school. We don't get a week off of work during the summer. So I don't know. It also just makes sense to me that we would be off.
Here. Maybe I'll implement that at acclimate.
All right, but you're just getting back, and how's the resettling going?
It's good. I made good progress this weekend on the behemoth of my backyard task, but that means that I think I am seeing the end of the project coming up, which is pretty cool. We're going to be. I've got to get some gravel to fill in the hole, and then some sand on top of that, and then I'll be getting some flagstone. But I think the project's pretty close to being done, man. Which is I've got like a couple. Yeah, exactly. I've got a couple of hard more days of work, and it's right in the peak of the heat, but I don't care.
We're going to talk about real heat. You're talking about Colorado heat. What are we talking? 78, 79?
Oh, no. We've been like mid-90s.
Oh, man. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I'll take it back.
And I was looking at the forecast here, and it's like low to mid-90s for like as far as the 10-day forecast every day. So
that's hotter than here.
It used to be that it was a cooler climate, but it's definitely warmer, which I think kind of feeds into what you were just about to talk about.
We're going to talk about it today. We're going to talk about places that were built for a climate that no longer exists. We'll start overseas. We'll bring it back home. We'll start with France. Just had its hottest day since 1947. 1,300 people are dead across Europe. The Leipzig, which is public transport, suspended its trams because, no joke, tracks melted. Nuclear reactors are shutting down, not from the cold, not from cyber attack, but because the river that used to cool them are just too warm, and so they're not safe to run with the river being as warm as they are. Meanwhile, the U.S. issued 31 emergency grid orders in the last 6 months. We did an episode on this not too long ago on what's going on in the U.S. But look, we built this for a climate, as I said, that just doesn't exist anymore. And, there are folks working on adaptation, but let's talk today about what adaptation really looks like. And so, look, the deaths are horrendous. We should, hold those folks in our hearts. But I also want to talk about the supply side of the grid and what's actually happening in European power generation right now. So Mike, do you want to tee that up for us?
Yeah, man. I think about like this. I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here, but stick with me. No, it never happened, right? So I trained as an engineer, and so like I think about like when as an engineer, like what do you build around, right? And you build around some sort of expected envelope of performance. And the tangent I was going to go on here is like sometimes when you think about like catastrophic events like the Fukushima nuclear disaster or the flooding in New Orleans around Katrina, as you engineer around like 1 in 1,000 year events, is what historically it would be. What happens if we have a 1 in 1,000 year event of like a tsunami, right? And what we found out is you have a nuclear meltdown. And is that an acceptable level of risk for a nuclear reactor? And I would argue no. A 1 in 1,000 year event is not acceptable, especially if you have 1,000 nuclear reactors. Now, the numbers and don't work out exactly this way, but we really talking about having like a meltdown every year? Somewhere in the world? Like, no, that's not an acceptable engineering standard. The other thing is, and when we talk about the Katrina event is 1 in 1,000. First of all, 1 in 1,000 year means it's a 0.1% risk of happening every year, right? But that is the only way that works is a historical context, right? What do we look back is the past predictive of the future. But we're increasingly entering a space now where the past is not predictive of the future. Matter of fact, we know it's not predictive of the future because we've absolutely changed all the underlying fundamentals. And so, for these nuclear reactors in France, they're not going to melt down, but they were built around a river that was going to stay a certain temperature. And they accepted that there may be some sort of engineering future where it might get a little bit warm, but we'll just shut it down that one time and it won't be that big of a deal. But now we're entering a point where like that river is going to be perpetually that warm. And so that matters from the supply side of the grid, which is like, what are all your underlying fundamentals here? And we're getting increasingly out of spec across the entire ecosystem, anything that relies on nature. And newsflash, folks, almost everything in engineering relies on nature in some way or another. And so we are going to see everything. And it's not just nuclear plants. I mean, like a coal-fired power plant also requires cooling and water in order to run its boilers. A combined cycle gas power plant, same sort of thing. So all the underlying fundamentals associated with power generation are up in question. And that, of course, includes renewables, but that's the case for renewables generally gets better, but not worse when that happens.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that caught my eye was this tram network suspended because the tracks melted. The Autobahn, which is the freeway, if you will, in Germany, the concrete expanded and burst. There's all these other things. Freight train in Sweden derailed. It's the power plants. It's also there's all this other stuff we built. And to your point about engineering, like you build it to a certain window, and it's usually like climate and seismic, right? In California, I live in California, so we think about earthquakes all the time. But you've got to build it to what kind of 100-year storm and what kind of like very rare earthquake are you gonna build to survive? And it turns out a lot of this infrastructure was not built for these kinds of temperatures.
Yeah, 100%. And so, we've talked about it before on the show about how that's driving a whole bunch of stuff in private markets about insurance, engineering around like what sort of, production that you can have, assumptions about like payback periods on like the revenue associated with that. And every engineering question is a system of trade-offs, right? So maybe you engineer for colder climates because you live in Switzerland. It's in the fucking mountains, right? And you think about like, okay, I've got to, engineer around pothole resiliency, right? But the flip of that is that you're probably making a road that's a little softer in heat. Well, how much, softness is acceptable as the world continues to warm up? Most of those roads are probably going to have full re-engineering. It's not, I mean, we'll talk about air conditioning, but it's not just like yell at the Europeans and shake your fists about how they're stupid for not having air conditioning.
No.
It's just like,
you're making choices about where to spend your money. And so that's why you build for the 100-year storm is, look, you can't build for the storm that's going to happen only every 1,000 years, because then you just over-engineer everything. And, every building, every road would just be unattainably expensive. So you build for, the 0.001 likelihood isn't going to happen. But, so that keeps costs down. For the earthquakes, you don't build to a, Richter scale 12, you build to a 9. I'm just making up numbers at this point. But like, I think the point is in Europe, the bigger danger really was cold weather. The summers were relatively mild. Like Paris was always known for its perfect summer days where you could just sit in the park and lounge around, and they still get some of those days, but more and more, it's not the cold that's the big threat. It's the heat.
Yeah, and this is going to be everywhere in the world, kind of all the same time. I mean, there's I think, a paper that came out a few years ago talking about India, but it also applies to other places around, like bulb temperature, which is there's a certain point in which humans, just even healthy, well hydrated people sitting in the shade, like where they just start cooking. Their bodies can adapt to the amount of heat and moisture that's in the air because of their perspiration won't evaporate until it's above 98 degrees Fahrenheit, which means you're only warming up as you perspire. Um, so we're going to start seeing a lot more of these events where like couple thousand people die. It seems to get hotter and hotter and hotter. And then there will be a point where it'll be the most catastrophic news story, probably in, since the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, where like there's a huge mass casualty event because the electric grid drops because of a lot of different reasons. People without air, even in areas with air conditioning, where if the electricity grid drops, then they won't have air conditioning and they start to cook. Like, it's just, there's some really catastrophic outcomes attached to this. And unfortunately, Europe is the warmest, or is the fastest warming continent on the planet.
Mm. So let's talk about where Europe is and is not adapting. So, clearly we're talking about Western Europe, Paris, Spain. I had friends in the UK. They don't have air conditioning in the UK because it's always cloudy and 68 degrees, right? But now they're in their flats, their businesses sweating. But in some places they've gotten ahead of it. Like, there are cooling centers, some mandatory welfare checks for elderly residents, and people are planting trees to prevent a tree canopy. Do you have examples of where to you things have gone relatively well, and others where they need to do better?
So when you think about climate, there's historically been kind of two different ways to look at it. One is mitigation, the other one's around adaptation. So mitigation is that how do you prevent the worst outcomes from coming to pass? And adaptation is about how do you change your ecosystem in order to prepare for the future that's coming. And there's obviously feedback, right? If you don't do enough on mitigation, then adaptation almost kind of doesn't matter to a certain extent, because like it's going to change so much that it's going to be very difficult to adapt. And vice versa. If you do everything on mitigation, adaptation is going to be underfunded, and there will be problems associated with that. And so Europe's been generally pretty good about mitigation. They have one of the oldest carbon markets and carbon pricing mechanisms associated with it. They've been really leaning into kind of carbon accounting more broadly. I mean, the reason for that is I think they're experiencing climate a lot more directly than almost anywhere else on Earth because of that. But I think you could make a very legitimate argument that they probably haven't spent enough money on adaptation, which is knowing that their world is warming faster than anywhere else. They need to be doing more than anywhere else. And in some of the short term, you can do things like the cooling center, like Chicago did that for years, right? Where, every summer there would be some, like, I mean, not every summer, but every other or every third summer, there would be some sort of heat wave, and there would be a lot of old timers that don't have air conditioning. And so you'd move them to that. But ultimately more and more people just got air conditioning. And that's probably the solution.
One stat that we looked up here was that 90% of the US has air conditioning. 20% of European buildings have air conditioning.
Yeah. Part of it's the way that they're built. It's hard to do like forced air and things like that. But like also like it's not that hard now with like, split, heat pumps and split cooling systems and a whole bunch of stuff there. They could do this.
Yeah.
So
just a window air conditioner, right?
Even that can be a little bit tricky because I think their windows tend to slide open. So a window unit's harder than one where it slides up.
Those crazy French, they'll figure it out.
Yeah. I mean, you can do it, right? Again, but what did you engineer to, right? Which is a slide opening window is a lot easier if you don't need air conditioning to just let the breezes in the evening. Yeah. Right. And so they have to re-engineer effectively their entire world for something that's much warmer.
Yeah. I mean, the other part that's maybe not obvious is that energy prices in Europe are a lot higher. So the reason 90% of Americans have air conditioning is in part because our electricity is relatively cheap and we can afford it. But one, the per capita income, so the average income of a European is far lower than in the US. And two, they're paying more for their energy, which means it's just, they just can't afford it as much. Then on the other side, which is where we started, the grid, let's just say in some sort of fantasy world, every European got a window air conditioning unit. The grid couldn't keep up.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a much higher demand in like energy consumption in the United States, like growth associated with like AI data centers, and like it's straining the grid, but we're keeping up, right? Like I think like the Europeans could get there, especially they have a higher degree of grid resilience in certain ways associated with like Denmark, Scotland. Some of these countries like are producing the majority, if not all, of their energy from renewable sources. There's probably a component of grid resiliency associated with batteries. One thing that like Germany's doing really, really well is they have these balcony solar sort of structures. Have you heard of those?
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
well, yeah, no, where they've got little units they can put on the balcony. Yes. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. So like in the US, for the listeners that are unfamiliar, I have solar panels on my roof, right? I had to get a contractor out and install it. And it was a multi-day process associated with it, cost a bunch of money. ROI pays back over, the better part of a decade. Just kind of tough, right? And like there had to be like a big upgrade to the electrical infrastructure. But in Germany, you can buy a panel and plug it into your wall, and it just feeds your local grid. And so there are things there that we could actually learn that they could definitely learn from us in certain ways, but also that we can learn from them. I know here in Colorado, they actually just passed a law for balcony solar here as well. And so there's probably some degree of grid resiliency associated with that. One thing that most European cities do better than most US cities, and this is anecdotal, but just personal experience, they tend to be a little bit better for trees. So in my experience,
yeah,
but not always, and so I think that there's a component of that as well.
Well, what about part of the issue here is that until it happens, people aren't super motivated to do anything about it. The fires in California over the last couple of years have motivated some people to take notice. But I'm curious if there's anything we can learn from your experience at Acclimate, getting people to do stuff that isn't like right in front of their nose. It's coming. You can sort of make the argument to them that it's coming, but like people aren't going to go out and make these changes. Estimates are that this is, $1 billion of infrastructure upgrades in Europe. Do people have to die, or can we get ahead of it?
I mean, well, people are dying.
Yeah.
So there's that. We are not ahead of it, and cannot get ahead of it. So the question is how quickly can we react before it becomes like catastrophic? And I don't want to minimize 1,300 deaths in France or whatever the number was, but like also like 10,000, 100,000, like
I don't know. Where's the tipping point? I don't know.
Yeah, and I get a little, at least in the US, like we had over 1 million people die in COVID, and people were angry about vaccines. So like sometimes like the deaths, that like the punch you in the face number where people that died still isn't enough, because we're dumb little monkeys that like get stuck in our own little tribal system.
Yeah.
The one thing I will say here that's a little bit different than the deaths, I think, is actually the uncomfortableness, the heat. The idea that like every European that is not without air conditioning, that has experienced the last couple of weeks, they won't forget. Like they were persistently uncomfortable and like couldn't think, were sweating, were going to avoid the heat as much as possible for as long as possible. Like that's going to stick with them. And I think that will actually be the thing that actually changes it, because I'm not in the habit of quoting Stalin all that often, but like,
but
he talks about
that,
but he talks about one death is a tragedy, multiple, 1,000 deaths or 1 million deaths is a statistic, right?
Hmm.
And so the underlying wisdom in that fucking awful quote is the idea that like sometimes you have to experience something very directly and personally rather than like just the kind of the number. And
Mm.
I think that's that direct experience of like how uncomfortable it is will actually drive behaviors a lot more than however many dead French people there were if you're French and you don't know somebody that died.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, most of my folks here in the US are sort of adjacently aware that Europe is hot, but it hasn't hit them. But let's talk about the US. We covered in an episode, I don't know, a couple months ago about all the emergency orders, Colorado, Indiana, Carolinas, Washington State. But, at some point, emergency stops meaning emergency. And what's actually going on is, um, is an emergency, but we've just become numb to it. So I don't know. You have, is it different here? Are we actually getting ahead of it, or are we just managing it in the same way that Europe is?
Uh, so the US is it's such a fractured ecosystem um, that the ways that we're responding to it are very different. And I think the greatest juxtapositions you can find there are between California and Texas, right? California and Texas, two biggest states by population, but also, even on a per capita basis, the two largest installers of renewable energy in the country. Um, and the way they got there was completely different. So California has been having, at this point, over a decade worth of focusing on climate associated with this. And they really help to incentivize a lot of to the development of renewable energy. Texas went full yeehaw on it and instead like just totally deregulated the market, which famously allowed the electricity grid to collapse during a cold snap. Also, probably climate induced for in Texas a couple of years ago, and then allowed people to die there. Uh, Again, Texas didn't care that people died. I mean, like they talked about it, but they don't really care. Um, and but as a result, because of the split in prices, the fact that there was like a big earning opportunity if you were able to deliver power during that point, it sponsored a whole bunch of adoption of renewables onto
Yeah.
the grid there. And so
It was a market solution.
it was a market
Mar-
solution that had human costs, and
mm,
so you can, you can decide what's, your particular cup of tea, but we have both cups of tea here in the
mm,
United States, dead people and no government, direct interference, but like, you get a lot of power one way, or you can have slower, a lot of government work associated with it, fewer dead people, but you get similar degrees of penetration there. In defense of Texas, they do seem to be accelerating further and faster now than California. It seems to be a more
yeah.
durable.
Well, that's really what I meant when I was trying to interject market solution. I don't think the market solution that it was a free market is the reason why we ended up losing life in Texas. I think it's pretty well documented that it was just mismanagement of the assets that were available. You can have that mix of assets, but how you control them is, uh, hopefully, we've learned that lesson. But I don't know. I mean, the
Well,
playbook.
I mean, the thing I'd push back on there is the reason that they weren't resilient to certain temperatures was because there wasn't any regulation requiring them to be resilient to that extreme, right? And
Mm,
so you
yeah,
could absolutely, and I would argue that you should probably, this is where my liberalism kind of falls apart a little bit. Like I would actually lean a little bit more towards the Texas model than the California model because I think it's a more durable solution. I just do think that there needs to be just a touch more regulation than the yeehaws.
yeah. No, I mean, I look. We risk broadening this conversation out to many other topics. My view, I think, fairly uncontroversial, is that free markets are amazing and do great work, but they have to be regulated. Almost, I mean, like the SEC exists for a reason. Markets will be corrupted and become unfair if not properly regulated, and they'll become dangerous if not properly regulated. But you do want to create the conditions for free market competition, because the strong will survive, and that's been a durable to play off of your description there. It's been a durable way to handle all sorts of challenges across housing and education and the stock market and energy.
Yeah, and to give California its due on the other end here, which is say if they hadn't have done that early market leadership, they wouldn't have created the demand that helped to make the economics of the Texas investments as obvious as they are. Like it takes money in order to get to the economies of scale that make it able to be the most cost-effective energy solution there is. So there's like maybe if you could like start in a California way when it's early and immature, and then transition, but like I don't think that's how human nature works. But so I guess we can thank both states in their own ways or cast stones at them. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, the U.S. starts from a higher position to deal with the heat. Maybe part of what we're revealing here is that the deaths that occurred in Texas were because of the cold, and that if you look at Europe, maybe they wouldn't have been as impacted if it was a cold snap, but they are more impacted by these heat waves. I'm just sort of looking for how do we chart a course forward? How do we get that $1 billion spent in Europe to become more resilient given the changing climate? And then, the US is a separate conversation. We've got air conditioning almost everywhere. But we're struggling with all these emergencies that are shutting down power for other critical things like defense, manufacturing, et cetera, because, we recognize, I guess maybe we should give credit where credit's due. I mean, the managers of those decisions are prioritizing human life over sort of industrial processes. That's of course a good thing. But it still puts us in this really sort of unenviable position where our grid is not up to the task of this resilience task.
Yeah, there's a component. I follow quite a few influencers kind of in this space, and I think one of them was your buddy Jigger Shaw.
He's
and
awesome.
And so like there's this like small component of like contract law that actually uncovers a lot of things, which is a lot of times like service level agreements have like I think they call it like 5 or 6 nines of uptime, which is will you deliver power to 99.999%, right? And so that's an engineering question. Like what is the expected outcomes? What do you have to do to cover for that? And a lot of times you can upcharge associated with that, which is you need this to be working effectively almost 100% of the time. We can't guarantee 100%, but like how close can we get to 100%? And that builds resiliency. So like so there's a component of like, how do we think about like the 99.999% for human life of resiliency? But can we dial that back to 99% or 98%, uptime for data centers? Like, does the world really end if OpenAI can't run its data center for a day or two a year? Probably not. Or maybe a couple hours out of several days a year, which is the more likely sort of scenario. Like maybe we can all just step back a little bit when it gets a little bit more warm and make sure that we're prioritizing the uptime percentages. And one of the things that Jigger was talking about there is that like if you dial that back from like some of these contract laws, we're actually at a pretty high degree of grid resiliency now. It's just when it's those really outlier cases that drive way, way, way more investment into kind of grid resiliency than we actually probably need.
All right, well, let's end it there and move on to the reader mailbag. I got 2 comments for you. One is for you, my good sir. Subgreen says, Mike likes that Australia looks to have peak emissions. Peak prosperity, at least. I'm not 100% sure I understand what this means, but he invokes your name, so I thought I'd give you a chance to respond.
Well, he should invoke my name. It's the most generic name on the planet. Actually, no, probably it's some Chinese name. I have no idea. But Mike Smith is very generic and worth invoking.
Yeah.
What I would say here is I think this is a tired argument, if I understand his argument correctly, which is that the consumption of fossil fuels corresponds to prosperity. And that's an argument that fossil fuel companies make a lot. And they talk about human flourishing being tied to energy, et cetera. And it's bullshit. And there's plenty of examples out there, including China here recently, which has decoupled emissions from prosperity. Revenue growth is not connected to fossil fuel emissions. You could make an argument on energy more broadly, potentially, but even there, I think it's starting to fall apart as we increase efficiencies. But at its purest form, you can look at multiple countries, the United States, Australia, a couple others, where emissions have not been going up as fast as prosperity has, and so it's just a bullshit argument. If I understand what Seb's saying,
Yeah, were those things connected before we had these alternative sources of generation, or is it just? My sense is that they were connected for a long time. Like energy generation, which was basically only fossil fuel generation, did bring lots of the world out of poverty. They were on a parallel path. I think what your point is that China has separated is evidence that they don't have to be lockstep, but maybe they have been in the past.
yeah. So there's a couple things that go into it. So one, it's correlation, right? It's difficult to prove causation on this one, just to be a math nerd. But there was relatively tight correlation. I think a couple things happened there, and this is why China is such an interesting case here. The first one is that like a lot of the Western countries have been decoupled for a good bit now, and so part of it is like the nature of what is economic prosperity and growth is not necessarily completely tied to the making of things. So, but the argument that you can make for that is that we offshored a lot of our making of things to other countries that were having to do this, et cetera. But China is the case that proves that, like, if that's the world's factory, India, same sort of thing, that is doing this. Like, if they continue to have economic growth without having to have it for tied to emissions, then the causal argument, the link of causal linkage that you would argue about, is completely broken. So, yeah, generally, access to energy does provide prosperity. We've increasingly moved from a manufacturing world into a world of knowledge and creation through other systems that aren't as energy intensive. And the energy that we are producing now is less carbon intensive. So you have a multiplying effect.
Yep.
Big nerd.
Yeah, I mean, I take all that. I also like there's a couple good books out there about, the fossil fuels and this is Alec Epstein's book about, I'm forgetting the name of it, The Prosperity of blah, 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 fossil fuels to the rescue. I can't remember exactly, but it's, he makes an argument that there is causation bringing people out of poverty, that fossil fuels have built the world around us, and I buy the premise, and I also buy the premise that there's a baseline of impact that could not have been achieved over the last 150 years. It also, I think where Alex Epstein and the folks who make that argument, to me, where that argument falls apart is like, cool, but like, now what? You can look backwards all you want, but like, also we've learned, we're smarter now. And if all you do is look at China and you don't look at anybody else, you can see that there are other sources of generation that are faster, cheaper, more sustainable. And that's really what we're about here. Like, okay, so fossil fuels built the current world. What's going to build the next 150 years? And I think it's, anyway, I think it's just short-sighted in general.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also say, like, it's not only what's going to build it, but what's adding more risk to us. And this whole episode has been a fact that fossil fuels now have it, and the whole world knows this, a major externality, a major cost to continuing to use them that right now is being borne by about 1,300 Frenchmen.
Yeah. Oh, the book, sorry, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels by Alex Epstein. It was given to me by somebody, one of my friends on the right, and I read it from cover to cover. Makes some valid points. I recommend it. I also think you got to as I said, I think you got to look forward. All right, next comment is, this was based on our episode about humanities majors beating computer science. This is from Katie Witt. And I think this is a comment that, we can do something about. It says 618 is where the topic starts for us normies. I went back and looked at the episode. That's when we stopped talking about our personal lives. So I don't know, Mike, do you want to comment about the normies?
I guess Kate doesn't like you. I've been joking. Maybe she doesn't like me. I don't know. Open to feedback actually from the listeners. Do you not want to hear about our personal lives?
Yeah.
I'm okay shutting up about that. Like I like talking about this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I also like talking to Neal and learn about it, and I think that makes us more approachable as people. But if you think that's just a bunch of boring foolishness, because I generally am a fairly boring person, then have at it, man. Like tell me about it, and I'll shut the fuck up.
Yeah, I'll second that. Open to feedback. We try to keep the personal banter to like 3 or 4 minutes. So I guess maybe that day we got a little out of hand. So apologies for that. But yeah, the idea is that we're humans and we have lives and we do a little catch up in the beginning. But yeah, if you don't like it, let us know. Next up is goods, bads, and others. Mike, what do you got?
Yeah, what's good for me right now is like this small little online resurgence of American patriotism. Um, ironically brought about by non-Americans. So the World Cup's happening in the United States amongst the 3 countries that are hosting it, but primarily in the U.S. And a lot of people are coming here and they're seeing the United States through the eyes of being a tourist. And there's some things there that like they're just kind of finding fun and that they enjoy. Like, uh, and it's dumb. It's like silly little American commercialism sort of things. Like they had the experience of going to a Waffle House and getting their hash browns scattered, covered in whatever all the
Yeah.
the things you can describe.
Covered and smothered.
Yeah, or a Buc-ee's, which is like, as a Westerner, I always thought it was like fascinating how much like Southerners like identify with gas stations. But having lived in the South, like some of those gas stations are pretty damn nice. So I get it. Anyways, so
Yep.
It's been such a weird approach to the 250th anniversary because the president has just like absolutely turned it into a griftathon. Like there's this goofy fucking state fair that like it really just looks like a Potemkin village, on the National Mall right now. By the way, the pool's full of algae. Like the U.S. is looking.
That was Antifa. It was all Antifa.
Yeah, blame Antifa. And more people have been arrested for like picking up floating paint chips than have been arrested in the Epstein files. So like, this country's looking really worn right now. And so I just like having recently toured, a couple of foreign countries and appreciating them for that. Like I think there's this component of like these tourists that have come to the United States and are like finding joys in the things that we find mundane.
Because Texas barbecue is fucking amazing.
It is fucking mind melting. And like everybody that's ever had it, like not from the United States, like there was like a Japanese tourist that was just like, oh my God, like the video of that.
I love it.
Exactly. So you just couldn't shut up.
Yeah.
So like there's like I've resolved to take some joy this 4th of July in some of the small pleasures of what it means to be an American, and just have a little faith that we're going to fix the big shit as we move forward.
Hey, amen.
My bad. Speaking of not so proud of like the big shit here, a Marine Lieutenant General, a guy named Gregory Masiello, recently testified in front of Congress about the Joint Strike Fighter, and he sounded, for all intents and purposes, like he was a Lockheed Martin contractor, defending the project rather than like what we require Marine officers, which is to be persons of integrity that speak the truth. And like this program has some fucking warts on it, and it's been a multi-trillion-dollar, bit, frankly, boondoggle. Like it's a great airplane, but it ain't delivering anything close to what it's been saying. And we've been doing this now for like 30 years. And it's long past time for us to get this thing fixed. And the reasons for that come from people like General Masiello fucking alighting the truth. You have a duty, sir. I mean, like we expect we expect people of your rank and stature to be people of character. And I don't make that accusation lightly, but I need you to fucking bear the burden. You have a duty. And I think I'm beating him up a little bit here because like he's not the only one by a long stretch. And I think that like Americans in public office have been creating a lot of excuses of why they don't want to do their duty anymore. And why like they're making excuses. And, you know, there's a Marine that, you know, when you and I were coming up, General Krulak, that was the counterexample to that. That was the example was talking about the Marine Corps was underfunded and under-resourced, and there was a problem with it being able to meet the nation's call. And that's just fucking telling the truth to power. And we need more people like a General Krulak and fewer like General Masiello. My other is Ukraine. It's been an interesting sort of thing going on right now. And Zelensky has been having like this 40 days of showing, or I can't remember what he was calling it, but like of special operations in order to kind of show it. And they've been making some real strides, you know, bombing with drones some of the facilities for oil and gas around Moscow. Some really kind of like horrific pictures of like dark skies full of, you know, sooty, oily smoke, you know, from Moscow. He's bringing the war to Russia. And I think that's a big deal. And, you know, we've been back and forth, but like the one thing that Trump responds to is power. He doesn't respond to ideals. He doesn't respond to anything. And you're starting to see you're starting to see the president of Belarus that are starting to soften their support for Putin. And they're starting to like undercut. And so, for example, early in the second Trump administration, he had that meeting with Putin in Anchorage, which was itself just like an abomination. And he pulled back on sanctions associated with that. And Ukraine just said, they just kept on keeping on, man. And so as a result, now he let the sanctions go back. And so Putin is starting to, feel a little bit of a vice here in a lot of ways. He's lost some of his allies. So my other is fingers crossed that we're starting to see the end of the Russian invasion.
Fingers crossed is right. Yeah. I hope that that means something.
Yep. All right, man. What's good with you?
Canada is good with me, man. Like the Canadians still love Hardpoints. I am so appreciative. That's still our best episode, and we still get comments on that episode and a few others.
To be clear, we love Canada too.
We do. They love Hardpoints, and we love them. And they made the round of 16 in the World Cup.
Yeah.
Like on a 92nd minute goal. And I've said this before, I'm not a soccer fan. I don't know what the fuck I'm watching, but I've gotten into the World Cup. It's on in the background all day long. And this was the only game. It was the very first game of the round of 32, and Canada pulled it out. So Canada, we love you. Not sure I know anything about the team, but I'm really happy for the fans.
Oh, Canada.
My bad is the tortoise of Guernsey. Now, you're not going to know what that is, but the animal rescuers on the island of Guernsey say they're experiencing an epidemic of pet tortoises escaping because of the heat. So I picked this because it's sort of tied in with what we spent the episode talking about. It sounds like a soft story, but it's actually not. It's kind of a metaphor because when the temperature goes up, even the slow-moving tortoisei figure out they need to go somewhere else. And if the tortoisei are adapting...
I think tortoises, right? It's got tortoises.
Yeah. Well, it's just like, if they're moving, if we don't pay attention to our own pain, maybe we'll pay attention to the pain of a tortoise.
Like a herd of galloping turtles.
Yeah. And then my other is the Ozempic and Wegovy. Those are the weight loss drugs, the GLP-1s that are out there, are now linked to a drop in violent behavior. That was a Rutgers study. And I don't know, I just find this super fascinating that, they weaken the link between impulsive tendencies and violent behavior when really the drug wasn't designed to do any of that. And I'm just sort of curious, where does it go? And I'm not for it or against it. I'm just sort of filing it under one of those, this is going to be a policy debate because we don't know the long-term effects of these drugs. I have friends and relatives that have been on them, and the weight loss is truly life-changing for the people that have used these GLP-1s. Now it becomes a mental health drug as well. And again, we just don't understand long-term impacts really at all. I can't see this not becoming a big topic in the future.
I mean, it's a big topic now. Like a couple things like I think about with the GLP-1s is one is funded by basic American research and all the things that we've ever seen about like, oh, the fleecing of America, or like they're investing, in the research of what? And you know where the GLP-1s came from?
Diabetes, I thought. Diabetes, no?
Gila fucking monsters. Gila monsters.
Oh.
They were researching the venom of Gila monsters and how it worked. And that was the beginning of the chain of events. And it was basic scientific research by the American government funding university research. That's how we got here. So I think that's like pretty phenomenal. Like this also ties into a bunch of stories about like how it's reducing alcoholism or gambling, and so like you wonder, like it generally is a good thing, it seems, from a health perspective and things like that. But, it also sometimes makes me think a little bit of like, what is it, Brave New World and the drug Soma that they had in that, like what stifles human impulse is sometimes impulses are great, they cause you to get off the couch and to go decide that the current situation is not correct. It also can, lead you into alcoholism. Who knows? So it's a little bit of like a suppression of like what it means to be human, but like to a certain extent we've also hacked what it means to be human. How people sell alcohol or food, has kind of hacked our infrastructure. So yeah, I mean, like that's why it's another, man. Who knows where this is going?
I'll cop to this. I'm just a little skeptical of medicine and what we don't know. And this falls into that category. I'm like super happy for the people that are benefiting. Also a little skittish of what could be looming.
Yeah, I hear that.
All right, man. Read us out.
All right, sir. That's it for this episode of Hardpoints. Thanks for listening, being part of the conversation on energy, national security, the startup economy, and climate. If you have a question or a comment about today's show, please send us an email and we may feature it on a future episode. The email, as always, is hardpoints.show@gmail.com. Hardpoints.show@gmail.com. As always, please make sure to follow us where you get your podcast, share it on social media like Substack, or send it to someone who might appreciate it. Thanks again for joining us. Hardpoints is brought to you by the Valor Media Network. Have a happy 4th, everybody. See you.